Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Regulatory Roundtable. I'm Tunri, Legal and Regulatory Counsel at Paystack. And today I have with me some industry experts, and they're going to join me in dissecting regulatory sandboxes and what they mean for the fintech ecosystem. So let's start with a quick round of introductions. First,
Yeah, thank you very much, Tony. My name is Tunji Odumoboni. I'm Executive Director, Africa, Emtech. Emtech is a fintech for central banks. We are very proud to say that because we take passion and pleasure in innovating for central banks. So currency innovation, regulatory innovation. So I'm very privileged to be here today to share some thoughts on the topic. Thank you.
And hi, my name is Nubi K. I am the startup programs lead at Paystack. I think in short, the mandate is how can we best work with startups, be a partner with startups to enable them grow and thrive on the continent. And I've been speaking to a lot of startups. The regulatory landscape or regulatory compliance is definitely top of mind for so many. So I'm definitely glad to be having this conversation today.
thank you. And
My name is Tochukwu. I am the market intelligence specialist here at Paystack. My team is mostly focused on helping Paystack understand industries, markets, and countries of interest or where we operate in. I'm also the writer and editor for Decode Fintech. Decode Fintech is our weekly newsletter focused on insights from African fintech. We also write a long form blog where we share deep dives into certain key aspects or certain areas in fintech in Africa. And I'm glad to be here.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So before we jump right in, I'll just give a brief background on regulatory sandboxes. So a regulatory sandbox is a framework set up by a regulator that allows fintechs and innovators to test their innovations through live experiments, but in a controlled environment under the regulator's supervision. And now we've seen regulatory sandboxes take over, most countries. The first regulatory sandbox was the UK's FCA sandbox in 2016. And since then, we've seen several countries implement the same. In fact, a few days ago, the Bank of Ghana actually announced the launch of their own regulatory sandbox in partnership with Emtech, which Tunji will tell us more about. But yeah, so let's get right into it. So my first question, so Tunji, something that a lot of people will be wondering is, do you really think that regulatory sandboxes have the potential to drive innovation on the continent?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very good question. And that question comes from the fact that it's one of the key benefits that is always talked about when it comes to why leverage a regulatory sandbox. I mean, over the weekend, I was with my kid. We had a family time out over the weekend, and we're in a beach house, and I was just amazed. I live and sleep sandboxes, so we had this small beach house, and there was a small sandbox that the kids were allowed to play with, and it was modeling different houses, and I was really fascinated just looking at him, and it tells the story of what you get with a sandbox because, I imagine if we have to build those houses, the cost of getting him to try his hand on building something could be very high, right? So he builds his house, some of them, even before he started modeling the other one, the last one he built is collapsing. So you have that opportunity to allow people try their ideas, right? Try their ideas. So it's a lot about, allowing people that freedom to fail and fail fast, if you like. So definitely that is one of the enablers for innovation in my mind, but also the ability to get data, right? To get data from the operations and the market activities of the fintechs when in the market. That could be really key. And I think the last one for me, and maybe very importantly, is, when you look at fintechs, the runway is not so much. So you have to be agile for a reason, because you're probably living on investor capital. You need to show returns very quickly. So you need to be agile, also with the regulation of innovation. And sandboxes create that opportunity for agility because you don't have to wait and see, which is the old way of doing it, wait and see. But now you can test and learn with the innovators, and hopefully that creates a lot of opportunities for us to see more and more innovation, not only in Nigeria, but across the African region.
Thank you very much, Tunji. That's very insightful. Like I said, a few days ago, the Bank of Ghana recently announced the launch of its own regulatory sandbox in partnership with Emtech. So a lot of these insights that you shared, you've had the opportunity of seeing this, live in practice. So what are some of the lessons that, you've, as a company, Emtech has learned from helping the Bank of Ghana launch its sandbox?
Yeah, thank you for calling that out. Very proud and privileged to be involved in that particular one and to be partnered with Bank of Ghana. I think that particular one carried a lot of learnings. Just to mention a few, I think one of the things you find with, I guess is not peculiar to sandboxes alone, but when you are implementing something that could cause a big change, you need to manage that change very carefully. So the whole stakeholder management around it is very key. So engaging with fintechs, engaging with fintech associations, engaging with the investor community, all of that is very key when it comes to having a successful implementation. I think that's something the Bank of Ghana did quite well in terms of just making sure that stakeholders are carried along, from the pilot phase up to where it is now that is opened up for people to come in and play in the sandbox. I think the other thing, that I tend to talk about very often and I see clearly from that from that implementation is that, you're trying to regulate a changing world of financial services innovation. So to regulate innovation, I do believe that there's a big need for regulators to embrace innovation themselves. So what we call regulatory innovation. So using enabling technologies to so if you, for instance, we look at the way fintechs build, a lot about leveraging things like APIs, loosely coupled systems, and bring multiple systems together to talk to each other. So fintechs are very comfortable speaking that way. You have regulators very comfortable writing paper-based frameworks and all of that. But how can we sort of bridge that gap? So technology can be a big enabler. So in terms of, even compliance reporting, in-market reporting when you're in the sandbox, leveraging technology like leveraging tools like APIs and other emerging technologies, I would believe is a very big game changer when it comes to how regulation can work with innovation. So that's another big learning that we see from that.
It's really great that you mentioned regulatory innovation because that actually leads me to my next question. So when people talk about regulatory sandboxes, one thing they usually mention is it enhances a constructive dialogue between the regulator and the innovator. And that's a dialogue that people believe that needs to happen. But when we look at the Nigerian fintech ecosystem, and this question is for Nubi, would you really say that we are ready for that dialogue?
I think I don't think it's a matter of if we're ready. I think we would eventually have to come around to the table to have these conversations. Because while you could evade those conversations or dialogue, at the end of the day, you have to answer to some kind of a regulator or someone who actually has oversight on certain industry that you're playing in. I do understand why there might be some hesitations, perhaps from historical, just engagements or things like that. But I think also there's a coming around of okay, we need to actually be at the same table. We need to have those conversations. Yes, I hope, again, part of what this conversation does is actually to start again, even changing that mindset and getting able to say, yes, let's have these conversations. Because, I've spoken to startups who have gone through different regulatory sandboxes in different countries. And the experience, do differ. And I hope you can take the learnings from at least the good ones. So some startups have told me where just again having that engagement with regulators in the sandbox environment has even signal to investors that, oh, you are actually de-risking my investment in you, because you're not at the risk of just getting shut down because you did not talk to the regulator in your market. And so I think yes, I mean, again, like I said, there are roles for the different stakeholders to play, but I think, again, whether you evade it now, you have to answer to it eventually. So rather than, again, have that combative kind of like attitude towards things, I think just having that, again, having that dialogue and just, again, coming together to have this conversation, which I think, again, I hope this actually, again, allows us to see more of. And again, like the Regulatory Sandbox is the first in Nigeria, like we've not had it before. I hope it's, again, another chance to even build that relationship between innovators and regulators, because in there are instances already, like, again, in the world where this has worked really well. And so how do we, again, replicate those? And where they have not worked well, how can we take the learnings and, again, avoid those things as we build, yeah.
That's definitely insightful. And I know as startup programs lead, like you mentioned, you've spent the last couple of months speaking to different startups on their experiences with sandboxes or their general thoughts about sandboxes. So what are some of the major concerns that you've identified that these startups have, when considering whether to enter a sandbox?
So there are few of them. I think one of it comes down to just alignment on expectations. So it's like, you don't want to, like, sign up to a sandbox, get in, and then get faced with another set of, like, expectations or directives or how you go up operating as a business. So I think that just being on the same page, and I'll give you an example. So I think in some sandboxes, the founder got in and then was told, oh, you can't market, you can't advertise your product, and that there was no way they were going to acquire customers without advertising. What would have been better was like, oh, perhaps you could advertise, but there's a cap on how many customers you could acquire or actually, like, serve this to while in the sandbox, and that would have been better off. I think it was actually around pivoting. Like, you can pivot while in the sandbox. Like, if you pivot, you have to exit the sandbox and then reapply into the sandbox. And the nature of startups is that you're likely going to have many pivots in the few starting months of your business and all, because you're still, again, experimenting and trying different things. So I think those kind of just alignments as well. I think the last one was actually just around just funding as well. So it's like, if I get into the sandbox and I know what to do, I know what I need to acquire, but I have no financial means to do that, then what was the point of all of this? And so what I said, perhaps, again, the sandbox in itself could help signal to investors for funders to actually secure investments. I think there's always that expectation also, like, perhaps there could be some kind of like stop in between gap to say, okay, yes, you're from the sandbox, here's some time or leeway or a grant or something that actually goes towards you then securing your license, so that, again, you don't just innovate and then you can make any progress, because, again, those licenses they're not cheap. they're quite substantial. So these are a few kind of like concerns, and I think for me, again, it just boils down to that setting the expectation and having that alignment before getting into the sandbox. And I think, again, hopefully with this kind of conversation, with the dialogue that the regulators, the CBN, and other stakeholders are having right now, even as they're designing this, I hope all of that gets factored in, and so that the experience actually, again, great for the founder as well as the regulator as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nubi. Tunji, do you have any insights on how some of these challenges can be resolved?
Right, indeed. So very good point. I think I found the point on not being able to pivot very interesting. I think those are things a regulator might not be wired to think about when you build a framework out on how the regulatory sandbox will work. But I think, indeed, for me, the way I look at it is, something is always better than nothing. You want to start from somewhere. I don't think anybody should pretend that, you put in a sandbox and it solves all the problem that you can ever think about when it comes to regulating fintechs or being regulated, depending on how you want to look at it. But I do think that the most important solution, that you can think of is even the enablement to engage. Just having an infrastructure or a solution that enables you to even engage the regulator, for me, is a very big win. Yes, there are going to be challenges. You have issues like some of the ones you've mentioned, And the reality of it is that for the regulators, is also a learning process. So just the way you have innovators iterate and build on their product, I expect regulators to learn from maybe earlier engagements that they will have in the sandbox and be able to improve on the sandbox operations, the framework. And I think one of the things that is really important to say is that in terms of this expectation gap, which you touched on, most of the time the requirements are set out, right, in the regulatory sandbox frameworks. And it's a question of interpretation. At times, the interpretation of a particular clause by the fintech may not necessarily be what the regulator intended. So just having that engagement as well is really key.
Thank you, Tunji. So we've talked about some of the benefits of regulatory sandboxes. We've said that they can enhance the understanding of the regulator. We've said they can enhance financial inclusion and even inform law and policy. But of course, there have to be some downsides to sandboxes as well. So we're going to turn to our editor-in-chief of Decode Fintech to shed some light on some of these challenges.
Thank you, Terry. So I think, like they have said, Nubi has probably alluded to some of the possible challenges that startups might likely face, or the perception of challenge that they are expected to face going into sandboxes. One very clear one is what happens if the CBN or the regulator doesn't agree or doesn't accept or declines my invitation. What happens when I get in and after the sandbox period? Because sandbox period is a test. A test has if you have fail or you succeed, right? So what happens when I fail, right? So I think there's not much clarity in terms of what those exit options are for many of the startups that might be going into this as well, right? Especially if you think about how startups themselves are, they are VC funded. There is usually an imperative for them to grow quickly while maintaining a certain amount of runway, both from management, from the board, from investors and all those things. So once they get into that sandbox, right, there is a very explicit expectation to succeed as a startup, right? But there are multiple outcome modes for the sandbox itself, which includes failure, right? So if I'm expected from investors to succeed by all means possible, but there is a chance that I might fail, what happens then? Because all that is time, and time is customers is money. You can see how that might go. So those are fears that a possible startup might have. Related to that is pivoting. As Nubi has already mentioned, right? Startups are a way to test an idea, right? They are not a bounded, their problem set is not bounded, right? They are trying to solve a problem, they are going into market, they are basically iterating on data that they get. If they are expected to go in and they realize that what they are trying to solve, there is a different angle to it, or there's an even bigger problem related to that, it seems for many of the frameworks available, they will have to step back and then try again, which again is still related to time. And another thing is related to exit options, right? It's not just about failure. There's even if I do succeed, what happens next, right? Is the time spent in this regulatory sandbox enough to give the regulator some confidence that I'm ready for a license, right? Because licenses across everywhere take time, right? Even before the advent of sandboxes. So if I'm going to spend some time in the sandbox and then I still have to wait for a license, that can make people not want to do that, right? They might rather go the route of raising a lot of funds and then trying to get a lot of licenses, and that might remove the regulator from helping those startups build the right risk foundations. Because a lot of times, what the sandbox is trying to do is build the right risk foundations. As he mentioned already, right? You see startups where they don't have KYC, they don't have certain things, and they will scale to a certain level and realize that because once you don't have those things, you're incurring operational debt, right? But they also have revenue to make. They have people to satisfy, right? So finding that right balance for them is always very hard. And most times, if you have to choose between making money or losing money, especially it's money you're going to lose in the future, it's usually very easy for them to just choose making money now. And that's why you see them they will go to they would try to go into the market, work their way into getting these these approvals or these licenses without necessarily trying to interact with the regulator beforehand, right? So another big challenge that comes to mind is from the regulators' perspective themselves. Like you mentioned, like a lot of this is no longer paper-based, so it's like right-click API, but it still requires reviews. It requires a very close touch supervision of how these startups work, right? So there's a chance that like there are a lot of startups. There's a very high amount of startup activity in Africa. Multiple startups are coming up every day with a lot of VC funding rising to record highs from last year, right? So if there are so many startups and there's only so many resources to actually monitor these people, right? So many people to even approve, right? So it creates like a narrow waist where like there is a wide funnel of people who want to pass through this place, right? And the odds that becomes very complex really quickly, right? For both the startups operations, and it creates a very expensive opportunity cost. Like if I'm going to go through this, why don't I just go through whatever alternative was existing before than going through like trying to meet the regulator right? It also creates an avenue for competition in the wrong sense, in that like if the sandbox becomes a prerequisite for like launching a product into the market, right? It means that like based on the bounds of resources, based on like the review processes of if you're ready or not, there are possible innovations that might actually be beneficial to the market, but maybe were not articulated properly at the time, or they didn't probably get the problem they're trying to solve properly, or there's just many factors that come, like the startups, like it's very fluid at the beginning. So like if the basis for which you are being rejected or you are being accepted changes, right, there is a chance that like we might like preclude or prevent like certain innovations from reaching the market, which also prevents the ultimate goal of the regulator of knowing what is actually happening. Because their eventual goal is to build a very systematic like framework from regulation to innovation, right? So if somewhere along that funnel, like something breaks, right, or like that funnel is no longer, it becomes very slim, and what the regulator starts accepting is what is acceptable now versus what can be acceptable in the future, then it creates, because it starts to lag innovation for the future. Like it creates, you're discounting innovation in the present, right? So that is one of the those are one of the possible challenges that we might see with a sandbox. The final one is like is perceptive. Is the idea that like if I'm putting a sandbox, right, I'm going to incur costs. I am going to, which the way ties to my first point, right? Like sandbox just offers me regulatory guidance, which is good. Like guided innovation is good, right? But I need money as a startup. Like if you are going to be moving people's money, if you are going to be transmuting people's money, that costs money too. Like Fintech is one of the places where like the marginal costs are very apparent. Like you're not, it's not like software where like you have very zero marginal cost for doing things. Like you usually have a provider that has a cost and you have to mark up on that to provide your cost. So like, it's not a case where like you have very little cost at the beginning, like your cost will scale as you grow. So like, if a sandbox is not going to provide access to capital, right? Like as a sandbox in itself, like that becomes very hard. Also, if you consider like the minimum capital requirements and the amount of money you need to spend to get licenses after you're done with the sandbox, right? If you are spending that time not getting a lot of customers, because customers begets revenue. Yeah. And that revenue is, if you design your products well, that revenue plus the funding you get from investors is what is going to use to like get those licenses, talk to the right regulators, right? So if you are limited in how much customers you can acquire in the very early days, right? It affects one direct revenue to the startup, but it can also possibly signal like the wrong things to possible investors who are looking, particularly investors that are very high growth focused, right? So if you are competing in a space where like you have a competitor that is, the hockey stick growth is like this, but you are still very conservative, trying to be right, which is good. I'm not trying to say that it's not good, but like you're also trying to get to a place where you can also signal to investors that like this business is good, and you can signal to that with building the right product mechanisms and the right business fundamentals. But you also need to signal that like people want products. Like it's right that we're no longer doing build it and they will come. Like it's not, your products are not made in a lab, they're made in the market. Like you throw it to the market, see how it works, and then you iterate quickly until you get market fit. So if there are constraints that affect how that will happen, then there's a ripple effect down to how revenue comes in, and also how you as a startup can then get the right licenses, the right things to move around. So those are kind of the things, possible downsides that startups might likely, or maybe sandboxes in this case, might likely see or perceive. Because to be honest, there are solutions to some of these problems. I think my colleagues here will likely mention, but like just correcting that or setting that perception is what we might expect.
Thank you very much, Tochukwu. That was so insightful, especially on the challenges that you shared. And one point I'm going to draw out that I found very interesting is your point on licenses. And this is a major misconception that people have about sandboxes, that belief that, okay, once I'm successful in a sandbox, the regulator would issue a license to me, but that's not always the case. You still would have to go through the formal process of applying for a license. But what the regulator actually does is they'll probably provide you with guidance on the license category to apply for and some of the requirements that you need. But just, so what do you say to startups, Tunji, that are like, okay, so why do I have to go through a sandbox if I'm not going to get a license at the end of the day? Why go through a sandbox just for a regulator to tell me this is the license you need? Why don't I just hire a lawyer or an external consultant? What would you say to that?
When you look at the reason, the real intent why regulators put sandboxes in place, is because typically there is this concern about this product. You want to take it to market, customers may buy because they maybe are not educated enough about the risk. So the regulator is also not educated enough, but they are paid to sense that risk and put guardrails to manage it, consumer protection. So what you get out of that typically is that a regulator says, okay, we understand this risk, haven't, evaluated the product, examined the product, tested the product with you for so long, and we think is nothing bigger than the existing risk we have in this type of service area, and you can use this license, that could be an outcome. But you don't get that outcome until, you go through that process. But it could also be an opportunity for the regulator to understand the tweaks they need to make to existing frameworks. So you engage a lawyer, as you said, or any practitioner. It could be that what they will tell you is, this product does not fit into any licensing regime because truly it doesn't fit into that's why it's innovation most likely. So you still then need to go back to the regulator to engage, because ultimately you need a license, right, to be able to play in a licensed environment. So I do think when you look at the opportunities you get, yes, it takes time. And to the point you were making about, okay, even if I succeed, what's the next step? Which is why I believe we need a lot of platforms like this to engage and to educate the ecosystem. One of the things you get, because truly it takes time to create new licensing framework if that's what is needed. But what you can get is you have a regulator that understands what you're building or what you've built. They understand the risk. I haven't tested with say within a 6-month period, if that's what the licensing duration, the sandboxing duration is. They can extend your stay. A regulator can extend your stay in the sandbox while they are working on the license. So it's not like you even have anything to license, because they've seen certain risk that they need to factor into the licensing regime. Maybe the capital adequacy requirement that you touched on is not exactly taken care of based on the existing licensing in the market. So you don't want to use a sledgehammer to kill an ant. So regulators need to go back and then look at it and say, based on our understanding of this model, we think we need to tweak this, or we need to create something entirely new. So, but I see a lot of opportunities. That said, I see a lot of opportunities in the transitioning, which is something we don't talk about often. So you are in a sandbox, and coming to that sandbox, you require certain things to come in. And as you are in, you also have unveiled data to the regulator. The regulator knows your business. So then transitioning into a proper license that enables you to, the regulator to remove certain guardrails that they put there in the sandbox becomes a lot easier because they know you, they know your business, probably have certain data about your business that they will ask for. So I see opportunities either way. Yes, it's not a silver bullet in that you still have to, look at that next phase after the sandbox. But it's always going to be the case because, as you know, sandbox itself is not the license to go unlimited or go eternally in the market.
Thank you for that insight. Another important point that Tochukwu mentioned previously was the point on access to capital. So this is another question, which is how do we graduate startups from sandboxes with the capacity to go to market if they don't have access to capital?
Right. That one is an interesting one. I hear startups talk about it a lot, and I think it's just understanding that there's so many things you can use a spoon for. You can't do the job of a fork, right? So sandboxes are not meant to solve all the problems that you would have as an innovator. There's a place for risk and managing risk, and the reality of it is whether you value that or not, it's something that can become very painful even when you've scaled. So I think funding, as you touch on it, the best I can think of that a regulatory sandbox will give you is credibility to get funding. But you've seen other regulatory setups where the regulator is encouraging startups to come, they have grants, maybe partner with certain development agencies. As an outcome of being in the sandbox, maybe you then get access to certain grant. But I think those are add-ons to the sandbox, not core outcomes of the sandbox, if you like. But yes, potentially being in the sandbox, complying to the requirements of the regulator, as we've much talked about on this call, is a sense to the investors that yes, you're taking risk management seriously. They can see a clear path to market for you and hopefully helps you attract funding.
Oh, thank you. Nubi, do you have any additional points?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really hoping as well because, while for fintech particularly, like a huge chunk of early stage funding usually goes to acquiring licenses, and the sad thing is that sometimes they're actually acquired incorrectly. Because I thought I was going to be this, but then I got this, and I don't really need this. I don't even know how to operationalize this, but I've spent this much money. So I hope the sandbox really at least is one way to actually at least mitigate some of those wrong decisions. And I agree about it not being a silver bullet. There are other stakeholders who could help you also get those learnings as well. Especially when you look at the number of demand or number of startups that would need to go through a sandbox, and perhaps we don't know yet if it's going to be a cohort-based versus a rolling-based model in Nigeria. So I definitely agree that yes, while funding is an expectation, one thing I hope is that at least with this now we have the regulators even reviewing the license requirements and all, perhaps launching new regimes of staggered licensing to say, okay, if you're doing this much revenue, perhaps you need to get a mini license, and then you graduate into a bigger license, and and that way funding then becomes less of an issue for startups. So you can experiment with okay, I have just 1,000 customers, I'm just paying this much money. If I have 10,000 customers, then perhaps I graduate into, and then people can actually are not having this sinking cost into license acquisition. So I hope again, the more and more innovators that go through the licenses, the regulators get to learn of this and also get to influence those changes as well from that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Nubi. Another point to mention is, given the complexity of the financial services industry, you're going to have situations where an innovation cuts across more than one regulator. So for example, someone is launching an innovation that has functionalities relevant to the CBN, SEC, NITA. So how do you create a platform that allows for all these regulators to collaborate in a sandbox?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very important consideration as we go forward. We are building with that in mind from the get-go. So our platform is a multi-regulator, multi-country platform that enables multiple regulators to co-create, co-supervise, if you like. And of course, there will be certain considerations around how to regulate certain spaces that may differ between regulators. So it's not necessarily to say you must always agree. But can we leverage technology to at least bring efficiency? So if there's an aspect of my business that CBN needs to say yes to before SEC can review, for example, so can SEC have the visibility almost in a real-time basis what CBN is seeing and the comfort they are getting and be able to then do that and vice versa. And you see that even happen more and more as we see a more regional integration. I think innovators ultimately want to take opportunities across different markets. So it's not even only cross-sector integration that we're talking about. We're talking about cross-border integration when it comes to regulators collaborating. And I think that is a very important use case that we're building for.
Thank you so much. This has been a very insightful roundtable discussion. So I'll end with one final question, and we'll just go around with everyone giving their insights. And that is based on everything that has been discussed, these challenges, some benefits from sandboxes. So how do we design the perfect sandbox? So I'll start with Tunji, of course.
Oh my God. All right.
It's a complex balancing act between risk and innovation. And how do you manage that? You can't be in your own world, in your own cocoon as an innovator or as a regulator. And so there has to be a lot of engagement, a lot of what are the concerns that the regulators have? What are the concerns that the innovators have on the other hand? And how can we build something that supports that?
Thank you for the insight. So would continue with Nubi.
Yeah, I think for a long time, I mean, and if you actually listen around to founders, at least in this space, you hear things like innovation always outpaces regulation, and but I think you could actually flip it as well, where regulation actually is a booster for innovation as well. And if we actually see, if we're honest with ourselves and actually look back, where the first person or the second person to do it might not have been the case, but there's a flushing of a lot of startups then riding on the regulations that then come about as well. So yes, I think for me it's like number one, that dialogue of between stakeholders. I think that understanding that yes, regulation could be impeding to innovation and just velocity and pace of things, but then how do we mitigate for those things? Because I think if we also don't deny that, then perhaps we won't make progress. So just saying, okay, where does regulation become a roadblocker, and then how do we then perhaps smoothen those bumps? Perhaps around, again, like I said, the exit options, the licensing and things like that. Like, just how do we smoothen these things? Because like Tochukwu mentioned, you don't want to actually have this sandbox, keep churning out startups, but then there's no clear next step, or just again a net positive contribution to the ecosystem. So I think that iterative modeling as well. Say, okay, those cohorts, this is how it played out. How is that different from the next year that we do this, and the next cohort and the next startup that goes through this experience as well? Which I'm really glad that around the data-driven approach which Emtech brings to the table, because then we can actually again look at the snapshot to say, okay, what has improved over time in terms of just again founder experience, pace of innovation, and again the changes, and even on the delivery of what the sandbox and the regulator actually wants to achieve as well. Are we seeing indeed more financial inclusion? Are we all still serving the same banked population as well? So I think again that's auditory kind of just checks to say, okay, are we making progress here? While the dialogue again that's required to then address those things, which again I'm very glad we are having this conversation. So more of this, and then I guess when we actually roll things out, being able to again pause again and check and see how things going based on the data, based on the feedback, and then improving on those things. Yeah, those are things I would say will lead us towards the perfect sandbox.
Thank you very much, Nubi. Then Tochukwu.
I think what they are going to do as a startup to mitigate risk, but at the same time, you want, if you zoom out, you also want that box to be very fluid in how like the startup can interact with it. Because like for Decode Fintech, a lot of times like we see a bunch of startups, like there are startups playing with niches within niches, like there are verticals within verticals within it's like Tetris. Like so you want a sandbox that recognizes that at its very foundational design, like of what it is, right? So the ever perfect sandbox, like Tunji said, is ever changing, right? Like it does not have rigid assumptions of what a financial startup should be. It is very risk aware, right? It's very clear and very legible on whatever risk problems it's trying to solve, but it's also very accommodating on like what a startup should be or what the startup's problem startup is trying to solve. Because look, like problems are very complex. Like solving financial problems for Africa is very complex, and that requires touching many things. That requires sometimes breaking many things, right? In terms of like and they're not necessarily breaking like people's money or something, but like changing the assumptions of how people think money should move and how money should be made, right? And you can't do that if like the foundational regulatory framework for that is still very limited towards like this is how a payment startup. Like sure, that those rigid lines can be very apparent in a licensed environment, like in a fully licensed environment. But for a sandbox in itself, that fluidity, like it's a particular kind of like a particular kind of vagueness. Like you are clear, you know what you're looking at, but you're ensuring that the startup is free to like it's like you said, like children playing in the sandbox, letting the sandcastles fall and rise, right? So if a sandbox can achieve that, I think that's one thing that can lead to a very perfect sandbox. So another thing is also like the technology template of how the sandbox works. Like everything from end to end has to be like it's like if I'm a startup and what I'm building is cutting edge technology, what I'm interacting with also has to be as good as what I'm building with. Like I don't have to be saying, oh, this thing is not loading, that thing is not working, I applied for this. So like if I feel like I'm a startup and this sandbox is a fellow startup, I feel like it encourages me to build more, to trust it, to trust that tool or that framework even more. So I think also like larger collaborations, like you said, like if I'm going to do this to get a license, then if I can get partners and give me funding, if it's even reducing like the initial paid up capital, because the reason why you give me paid up capital is because you're trying to front load risk. You're trying to ensure that like I have a very robust amount of money to portend any like bad thing happening, right? But if I have spent a fair bit of time with you to actually like make you understand that like I have the right risk conditions ready, I think that can swap for like the minimum capital that I require, because like you trust me. Like it's like giving someone a loan. It's like you trust me enough now. Like like you trust me enough now to know that like I can pay less to get into this. It can take me less time to get into this. It can take me. So that's what I think the perfect sandbox should be. Perfect sandbox should be it's a way to get into a relationship with the regulator that benefits them both financially and like compliantly. So I think that's how I think the ideal sandbox should
Thank
be.
you for those very brilliant insights. And this has been really great to have everyone participate in this. Thank you again. And that's it for our regulatory roundtable.